Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of reading and writing and things like that. And this is part of a series of Ask Me Anything kinds of questions about writing. And I was doing a bunch of questions in single videos for a while, but then some of the questions that I was getting were big enough that I wanted to devote individual videos to them. Today's one of those days. So today's question is from Today's question is from Artex98, and he or she, I don't actually know, asks, how difficult is it to create characters which are not just copies of yourself? If a character is completely different from you, how do you become this character? Do you do some sort of method acting? Do you look for such a character in real life and study him or her? And this is a great question, and I want to come at it in a couple of different ways. And of course, as ever, I should say, my answer to this question is going to be different from other writers, and the key is to find what works for you. And by works, I mean both produces writing in quantity and produces good writing. If one of those things isn't happening, then it's not working. So what do I do? So let me come at this, as I say, in two different ways. First way is to say I'm writing characters who are not like me, and I know that going in, right? I am going to embrace a character who is very different from me. So, of course, some of this is about research. It's about grounding the specifics of that character's life in things that, even if I don't know them from personal experience, I can understand them and then see how those things shape character. Easy example. My character is a plumber. I have limited experience as an amateur plumber, but it's something I can research easily enough. I can look up how to do certain things on the internet. I can follow YouTube tutorials. I can familiarize myself with certain kinds of plumbing repairs, tools, practices, those kind of things. All of which will be part of that character's mindset. Things that they may have nothing to do with the main plot, but they're the kind of things that that character in their internal monologue can drop references to, or to make passing reference to show the reader that they know what they are talking about. This is their area of expertise. This is important because you need to get these kind of things right, because the moment you get things wrong where your readership might know something about that thing, if you get it wrong, then the whole, for a split second, or maybe much longer, but for a split second, the reader is knocked out of the reality of the story. You just said something that is inaccurate. I've just been watching a bunch of Miss Marple adaptations on TV, and while I know that Agatha Christie knew a lot about poisons, she didn't know anything about guns, which is very English, of course. And she's constantly referring to automatic or semi-automatic pistols as revolvers. And I knew that this was the case in the books. I've seen it many times, and people have pointed it out many times, but I saw recent TV adaptations in which they make the same mistake. They show the pistol, and it's an automatic, and they refer to it multiple times as a revolver. And it's weird. It's like, and in that moment, I'm immediately knocked out of the story. Does it matter in the grand scheme of things? No. But if you get the specifics wrong, people are going to notice. And every time that happens, you lose a little credibility, and the reader will not go with you quite as far when you ask them to believe in things that are less plausible, right? When you want a character to behave in a way that suits some element of the story that you're trying to tell. If the reader believes the character is a real person, they're much more likely to go with them when they do things that are a little out of the ordinary, or when they encounter or experience things that are unusual. So getting those kind of specifics right in terms of the research part of grounding the reality of what that person does makes a difference, right? That's a simple example. But, I mean, I've mentioned before when I was doing the first Secret Machines book with Tom DeLonge, and I had decided that one of the main characters was going to be a Harrier pilot. I'm not a Harrier pilot. I have never piloted an aircraft of any kind. So I started talking to aircraft pilots, and they put me in touch with specifically guys who flew Harriers, and talked to them about what makes a Harrier different from, say, an F-16, right? In terms of how they handle. Now, turns out to be important because Harriers have particular features in terms of they're finicky aircraft. They're quite erratic in terms of their structure, and so they have to be manipulated in a certain kind of way. They also have the sort of the specific feature of the short takeoff and landing thing, none of which would necessarily matter unless I was using those things in the story. But they matter in that as I talk to people, and I talk to other people about Harrier pilots, a pattern started to emerge about the kind of person who would become a Harrier pilot because the aircraft is so finicky. And this I found really interesting. And it requires, to fly this kind of aircraft, requires a lot of skill sets and a lot of confidence. And it leads to certain sort of stereotypes about Harrier pilots as being cocky or sure of themselves, even arrogant, because there's this idea if you can fly a Harrier, you can fly anything, right? So that's where the hard realities of research start to inform character. This is less true of, say, a plumber. But I think if you were going to write a character who was a plumber, you would want to sort of say, okay, so for example, why did this person become a plumber? Right? Why, for example, did they not take a white-collar career? Was that not an option for them? Is plumbing that something in the family? Is it did they have to drop out of school for some reason and then finished up doing sort of either an apprenticeship or technical classes, right? So there's backstory here that you need to answer these questions for, to start to fill in the specifics of how this person came to be in this particular position. Are they good at it? Is it financially rewarding? And then you've got to start asking those other kind of questions about what these people are going to think about. How do they bill their customers? How do they make sure that they make money? What happens when things go wrong? What's malpractice insurance like? Or whatever the equivalent is. How do they stay up with code, in terms of making sure that the stuff that they do for people works and that they're not going to get into trouble for what. So all these are finicky little things, but they are going to be uppermost in the professional aspect of this character's life. Then you can start saying, what else is going on in this character's life? What's their family situation, their relationship situation? Are they married? Do they have kids? Are they gay, straight, whatever, right? All of those kind of things, they can start to fill in. And each one, I would say, you make these notes as you go, as you start to think them through. Some of this, especially with a secondary character, might simply emerge as you write. It just comes out in a sentence, But then you've got to sort of retain that information so that you stay consistent. This is one of the things about being a good editor and somebody who tracks the characters well, so that you don't run into a situation where you have what the movie people call continuity problems. Something as simple as, in one scene early in the book he's got blue eyes and then later in the book he's got green eyes. I mean, again, it's unlikely that matters. But if it's a mistake and the reader spots it, it's a problem, right? So you want to make sure that everything about the character is consistent. So when I start to build a character, if not in the first draft, I mean, some of this I might do in the outline stage beforehand, but often, especially if it's a minor character, I won't. These character notes will emerge as the character develops as I write them. And then I'm going to make sure that I know all of those things. I might make a separate sheet that charts what pieces of history I have about the character's backstory, their physical appearance, certain phrases that they use, attitudes, political beliefs, whatever. All of those things get noted down so that I make sure that the character is consistent, unless I want them to not to be, right? I don't say that the character has to be the same all the time, but if the character is going to sort of stretch and move into a different area, if they're going to evolve in the course of the book, that's something I need to be alert to. I need to be able to explain it. I need to say why it's happening, right? So that the reader goes with me. So those kind of things. I mean, and as I say, I'm starting from a standpoint of simply researching jobs, places that they're born, upbringing, family dynamic, education, interests, skills, talents. Those are the kind of things that shape who we are, right? So backstory, I think, is really important. It's a little bit more tricky when we start to move away from people who are like us, right? If I write a character who's very different from me in terms of sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, things like that, which are not just jobs, right? Not just practices or skill sets or ways of making money, but things that are deeply ingrained into your sense of self. And that's where I think authors can make mistakes, get things wrong, and possibly cause offense as they do so. And frequently, I mean, occasionally some people set out to cause offense and that, whatever, but often they do so inadvertently. And more often than not, that happens because you don't know what you don't know. You know? If I am writing a character who is not like me, I need to be thinking about the ways in which they're not like me. And at some point, I'm going to want readers who are of that same ethnicity, gender, whatever, to read what I'm doing and to be able to tell me candidly, here's where I think you're getting it wrong, or here's where you are inadvertently being offensive or whatever, right? And I would also say that if you don't have people in your circle of friends who can do that for you, then I would think really hard about whether you wanted to write those kind of characters. I'm not going to write, if I have no black friends, I'm not going to write black characters, because if I do, my sense of black people is based entirely on what I've seen on TV and the movies, which means that I'm walking blindly into any number of stereotypes or issues that, I don't know how other people are going to respond, right? So I would say when it comes to writing outside your own position, your own subject position, that's something that has to be approached very carefully and thoughtfully. I've said this before, so I'm not going to labor the point, but I do think that it's crucial that you have to then imagine how being in any given situation is different from, if the person that you're writing is not like yourself. Yeah? And at some point you're going to want people who can speak to those things directly to tell you. Not least because after the fact, when the book is published, it's too late, And when people say, well, I found if I'm writing a character, an Indian woman, say, if I'm writing an Indian female character, and then I have an Indian female reader say, I found this offensive, it's not any use for me to say, oh, well, here's why you shouldn't have been offended. Right? Let me explain to you why my intentions were good and you just took it the wrong. Useless. No, that's not how this works, right? If somebody's offended, they're offended. And is it possible that one Indian woman might be offended and another Indian woman might not be offended? Sure. People are not, social, cultural groups are not monoliths, of course. But you need to be alert to the possibility, and you can't explain your position after the fact. So all of this is to say, do your research and make sure that you have people who can check in on you when you're writing this kind of stuff to help you navigate problems that you are almost inevitably going to run into, in the same way that if my plumber uses the wrong wrench, somebody's going to call me on it, right? It's the same, you know? So I think that that's one thing. In terms of humanizing people who are not like me, as the question implies, yes, I will. I spend a lot of time people watching and listening to other people's conversations in restaurants, and which my family hates, but I just can't not. You know, I love. Sometimes if I'm taking a walk and I just happen to linger near people who are talking, and I get these snatches of dialogue that I think I would not have come up with that. But I can write that down and it'll sound absolutely real, because it is absolutely real and it wouldn't have come from me, you know? So using reality to inform your fiction, I think, is really good. Though, of course, I will also say that the fact that something is real doesn't necessarily justify it, right? If a reader writes to you and says, I thought this scene was completely implausible, and you say, well, that actually happened. I saw that actually happen. That doesn't necessarily make it a convincing part of the story. Truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, as we know. So simply relying on truth to justify your writing doesn't always work. But yes, I would say, you know, listening to people, watching them, paying attention to the things that they do, all of these things are incredibly helpful. And that includes thinking of characters as maybe resembling people you know. That can be useful. You pick up little tics, little mannerisms. That, I think, is a really great way of adding little plausible details to characters. Though I would also say that you then need to bend over backwards to make sure that the people that you're mimicking don't see themselves in those characters, not least because you don't want to get sued if they don't like the representation. But, you know, most people, if you take a mannerism from somebody and then switch the gender or something, they're not going to recognize themselves. Saying too much. So all of that is about consciously imagining people who are not you and doing the research to make them plausible. But now I want to come at it from the other side. The question starts off by saying, how do you make sure that they're not like you? And I want to push back a little at that and say that is not entirely a bad thing. I was recently I just finished the first draft of the second Hideki Smith book. And when I was talking to my son about it, the first thing he said was, the difficulty in talking about this is that I see you all over the book. Not just in the character who resembles you most, that is the father in the family. I see things that you think and things that you say and things that you believe in everybody in this story, including the bad guys, you know. And I think that's great because I'm real. I'm an actual person. And so if I can get some of that kind of stuff into the characters that I'm writing, then they will also be real. And it's particularly useful to have a personal connection to a villain, right? To be able to think of them as a thinking, feeling person who does what they do for reasons that make sense to them, you know? It's good sometimes to think, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. In slightly different circumstances, if I had had a different set of experiences, I might go in this direction. And that, to me, feels perfectly real and plausible. And that's a good way to approach a villain, because we've all read villains who seem to be sort of stereotypical collections of every psychopath or Darth Vader or whatever that we've seen on TV and movies and in books, where they're just sort of evil for the sake of being evil because it's cool and because that means that they're scary. Okay, do such people exist? I guess, but ultimately they are not very interesting. I think, one of the sort of central tenets that I have embraced as a writer is to believe that every character in the story might have their own story. That with a shift of perspective, any character in the book could be the protagonist, which is kind of a cool way of thinking about it, right? That they are rich enough and deep enough and real enough to be the thinking, feeling heart of the entire book, You're not telling it from their perspective, but you want them to feel in the moment that they all have an inner life. And this is particularly useful. And let's come back to what I was just saying about writing people who are clearly not like you in terms of, say, race or gender or whatever. Because I think there is a tendency of, especially, let's be honest, white, male, straight writers like me, to say, now, what would a woman do in this situation? What would a black person think? I mean, when you put it like that, you can hear how bad it sounds, right? How clunky and cartoonish and oversimplified. Because that's not how people are, right? First and foremost, your characters have to be individuals. They have to be real people. So if there's something of you in them, that's a step in that direction. It's a step towards having a character who may be something other than yourself, but is also a thinking, feeling presence that you can relate to and connect to. They're not a series of stereotypes, a series of ideas that you've grabbed from things that you've read or seen, where they get flat and they behave in ways that suggest that you do, on some level, think of these characters as monoliths, I mean, the moment you say something like, what do women think about X, you're in serious trouble. I've always hated those sort of men are from Mars, women are from Venus type analysis. It's like, this is so obviously and profoundly stupid, I don't even know where to start. And if you try to write fiction that way, oh boy, no. I mean, the most interesting characters are those where the things that make them what they are, including their sort of social positioning in terms of things like race and gender and so on, are real and pressing and shaping, but they are also individuals within those contexts, right? Which is how people are, So I think that seeing yourself in all your characters is not necessarily a bad thing. And there is, as the method acting remark in the original question suggests, a very sort of Stanislavskian way of accessing this, right? A way of saying that, once you've been cast in a role, the job of the actor, or in this case the writer, is to imagine themselves in that character's situation with all the given circumstances of that character's life and backstory and their current predicament, and then say, if I'm in that, how do I behave? How do I think? How do I act? How do I speak? What's driving me? What's motivating me in the moment? Not just the sort of macro, I want to be successful. I want to take over the world because I'm a villain and I'm twirling my mustache because that's what... It's the specifics, right? The desire for your character to always want something, for them to be constantly trying to sort of to move the story forward in some way, right? Which is a sort of fundamental element of writing fiction. And in order to do that, they have to be motivated. They've got to be something that they want, which makes sense for them. And this is why I think it's really useful for an author to be able to think themselves into every role, every character in this story and say, if I was that person, how would I behave? That doesn't mean that they have to do what you would do yourself as you are now. It means that you're trying to give consciousness and subjectivity to your fictional creation so that their inner life makes sense. And the best way to do that, in some ways, is to imagine yourself in that position. You're different. You're a different person. You have a different backstory. This is what I mean about given circumstances. That's that very Stanislavskian thing of once you have established the premise around your character, all the things that make them who they are, how do they function? Because they have to be, first and foremost, people, right? And this is particularly important when you're writing somebody who is not like you. Because the last thing you want is for them to turn into a stereotype, into a flag, into a symbolic image of something rather than an actual person. Because all narrative is character. Yeah, I'll stand by that. Yeah. So I think that's it. That's all I'm going to say. But I thought it was a really good question, and I really appreciate it. And as ever, feel free to submit more questions either in comments on this video or by email through my website. And also, as ever, like, comment, subscribe, check out my books. You should be reading my stuff if you're going to pay any attention to what I say about writing. Because if you think my books are rubbish, then you shouldn't take any notice of what I say. And that goes for all other writing teachers as well. Check out my Patreon page. A thank you to them. I have a little merchandise shop which you might check out. And that's all. I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.